My name is Hans Muller. I'm 73 years old, and on March 15th, 1944, I died for exactly 11 minutes and 42 seconds when my Messerschmitt was shot down over the English Channel. What happened during those 11 minutes changed everything I believed about God, war, and forgiveness. I've been a devout Christian for 30 years since I was 22 years old, flying my Messerschmitt Bf 109 on what would be my last mission. The morning of March 15th, 1944 started like any other at our airfield near Calais. I remember pulling on my leather flight jacket, the same one my father had given me when I graduated from flight school. Back then I wore that uniform with such pride. We were the Luftwaffe elite, defenders of the fatherland. I believed every single word they told us about our sacred duty. The briefing room was filled with smoke and nervous energy. Our commanding officer spread out the maps and pointed to our target coordinates over the channel. We were supporting a retreating German unit that had been cut off by Allied forces. Our job was simple: provide air cover and eliminate any British fighters that threatened our ground troops. I sat there taking notes, memorizing flight patterns and radio frequencies, completely convinced that what we were doing was righteous. When you're 22 and your country tells you that you're fighting for survival, you don't question the orders, you just follow them. But I need to be honest with you about something. By March of 1944, things had begun to change inside me. Not the kind of change you talk about with your squadron mates, but the kind that keeps you awake at night staring at the ceiling of your barracks. I had been flying combat missions for 2 years by then. I had seen things that didn't match what they taught us in training about clean warfare and military targets. Just 3 weeks before that final mission, we had been ordered to strafe a supply convoy moving through a French village. When we dove down for our attack run, I realized it wasn't just military vehicles. There were civilians mixed in with the trucks, families trying to evacuate with their belongings. I watched through my gun sight as women grabbed children and ran for cover. I saw an old man fall and not get back up. That night, I couldn't eat dinner. I kept thinking about that old man's face. Ask yourself this question. When does following orders become following something darker? When does being a good soldier cross the line into being something else entirely? These were the thoughts that haunted me as I climbed into my cockpit that morning. I was still putting on my flight helmet and checking my instruments, but part of me was already questioning everything I had been taught to believe about honor and duty. The weather was perfect for flying: clear skies, good visibility, light winds from the northwest. My Messerschmitt was running beautifully. She was a reliable aircraft, and I had complete confidence in her capabilities. We took off in formation just after dawn, 6 fighters heading out over the channel toward our patrol coordinates. The sunrise painted the water below us in shades of gold and orange. Under different circumstances, it would have been the most beautiful sight in the world. About 20 minutes into our patrol, we spotted them. 4 British Spitfires approaching from the south, flying in perfect formation. My squadron leader's voice crackled through the radio, giving the order to engage. My heart started pounding the way it always did before combat. You feel this mixture of fear and excitement that's impossible to describe. Your hands get steady, your vision sharpens, and everything else in the world disappears except the task at hand. The dogfight began immediately. 6 German fighters against 4 British ones, all of us diving and climbing and rolling through the sky at speeds that would terrify any sane person. The sound of machine gun fire filled my headphones. I could smell cordite and engine oil. My aircraft shuddered every time I pulled the trigger, sending rounds toward enemy fighters that were trying just as hard to kill me. That's when something happened that I've never forgotten. I found myself in a head-on approach with one of the Spitfires. We were flying straight toward each other, both of us firing everything we had. In that split second before we broke away from each other, I saw his face through his cockpit canopy. He was young, probably younger than me. Blonde hair, intense blue eyes, jaw clenched with concentration. For just a moment, our eyes met across the space between our aircraft. He looked exactly like my younger brother Klaus. That realization hit me harder than any enemy fire could have. This British pilot wasn't some faceless enemy or abstract threat to my homeland. He was just another young man, probably with a family who loved him, probably with dreams and fears just like mine. He was wearing a different uniform and fighting for a different flag, but underneath all of that, he was human just like me. I hesitated. For maybe 2 seconds, I stopped firing. I watched him pull up and bank to the left, and I could have easily followed him and finished him off. But something inside me rebelled against it. Something that had been growing stronger with every mission, with every civilian casualty I witnessed, with every night I lay awake thinking about that old Frenchman who didn't get back up. That hesitation cost me everything. While I was wrestling with my conscience, another Spitfire came diving down from above. I never saw him coming. The first burst of his machine guns tore through my engine cowling. I felt the aircraft lurch violently to the right. Black smoke started pouring from my engine, and the smell of burning oil filled my cockpit. My instrument panel lit up with warning lights, and I could feel the controls becoming sluggish in my hands. I tried everything I had been trained to do. I adjusted my fuel mixture, worked the throttle, attempted to restart the engine. Nothing worked. The Messerschmitt was dying around me, and we were still 15 miles from the French coast. Below me was nothing but the cold, dark water of the English Channel. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. I was going down, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. My aircraft was losing altitude fast, and my engine was completely dead. The Channel water was rushing up toward me, and I knew that impact would either kill me instantly or leave me trapped in a sinking fighter plane. I had perhaps 30 seconds to make peace with the fact that I was about to die. The impact with the Channel water was unlike anything I could have imagined. One moment I was gliding through the air in a powerless aircraft, watching the dark waves rushing toward me, and the next moment my world exploded into chaos. The Messerschmitt hit the water nose first at nearly 200 kilometers per hour. The sound was deafening, like a giant hammer striking an anvil. Metal screamed against metal as the fuselage crumpled around me. Water immediately began pouring into the cockpit through cracks in the canopy. The shock of the cold hit me like an electric current running through my entire body. Channel water in March is only a few degrees above freezing, and it felt like liquid fire as it soaked through my flight suit. My aircraft was sinking fast, nose down, and I could feel us descending into the black depths below. I fought desperately with my safety harness, my fingers numb and clumsy from the cold. The leather straps had tightened on impact, and the metal buckles were slippery with seawater and blood from cuts on my hands. Above me, what remained of the cockpit canopy was cracked but still intact, trapping me inside like a glass coffin. Through the fractured glass, I could see the surface of the Channel getting farther away as we sank. Panic took hold of me completely. I thrashed against my restraints, pulling and tearing at anything I could reach. Water was now up to my chest, and it was rising fast. My breathing became rapid and shallow. Each breath was a struggle because the water pressure was crushing my ribs. I could taste blood in my mouth, probably from internal injuries caused by the impact. The strangest thing was how quiet it became as we sank deeper. The violence of the crash gave way to an eerie, muffled silence. All I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears and the sound of air bubbles escaping from the sinking aircraft. The water around me was getting darker as we descended, and I realized that the surface was now impossibly far above. My lungs were burning from holding my breath, but I knew that once I let the water in, it would be over. I made one final desperate attempt to break free from the cockpit. I used both feet to kick at the damaged canopy while pulling with all my remaining strength at the harness release. Something gave way, and suddenly I was free of my seat. But freedom didn't mean salvation. I was still trapped inside a sinking aircraft, now completely underwater with no air left in my lungs. I pushed upward against what remained of the canopy, but the water pressure was too strong. My vision started to blur around the edges, and I could feel consciousness beginning to slip away from me. That's when I gave up fighting. The moment I stopped struggling, something extraordinary happened. The panic left me completely, replaced by a sense of calm that was deeper than anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't resignation or defeat, it was more like acceptance, but acceptance mixed with curiosity about what was coming next. My lungs finally gave out, and I breathed in a lungful of seawater. Drowning is not like what you see in the movies. There's no dramatic thrashing or calls for help. It's surprisingly peaceful once you stop fighting it. The burning sensation in my chest gradually faded, replaced by a strange lightness. My heartbeat, which had been racing with terror just moments before, began to slow down. Everything became very quiet and very still. Then something impossible happened. Suddenly there was no more struggling, no more pain, just perfect silence. But it wasn't the silence of death, it was the silence of being completely, utterly at peace for the first time in my life. The crushing weight of the water around my body simply disappeared. The cold that had been numbing my limbs vanished completely. I found myself floating above the wreckage of my aircraft, looking down at what was happening below. I could see my own body, still trapped in the cockpit, motionless in the dark water. There was no emotion attached to seeing myself like that. It was simply interesting, the way you might observe something happening to a stranger. I felt completely detached from that physical form, as if it had never really been me at all. Above me, I could see the surface of the channel clearly, even though we were now at least 30 meters down. The sunlight was streaming through the water in beautiful, shifting columns of gold and blue. I watched British rescue boats approaching the crash site, their engines creating white wakes across the surface. The men on deck were pointing toward the area where my plane had gone down. I could see everything with perfect clarity. Not just visually, but in a way that's impossible to describe. I knew exactly what each of the rescue workers was thinking and feeling. I could sense their urgency, their professional determination to find survivors, their growing certainty that anyone in that aircraft would already be dead. One of the divers was preparing to go down, checking his equipment with practiced efficiency. Look inside your own heart right now. You know when something is beyond normal human experience. What I was experiencing was not a hallucination or a dream caused by oxygen deprivation. My consciousness was more alert and more aware than it had ever been while I was alive. I could think with absolute clarity, process information instantly, and understand things about reality that had never made sense to me before. I was no longer in my physical body, but I was more myself than I had ever been. It was as if I had been wearing a heavy coat my entire life without realizing it, and suddenly that coat had been removed. I felt lighter, freer, more alive than living had ever made me feel. There was no fear, no confusion, no sense of loss, only wonder at this new state of being. The boundary between life and death, which had always seemed so absolute and terrifying, turned out to be as simple as stepping from one room into another. I was still Hans Müller, still the young German pilot who had been shot down over the channel, but now I was Hans Müller without the limitations of flesh and blood, without the restrictions of time and space that had defined my existence for 22 years. I understood intuitively that my physical death had been recorded at 10:47 a.m. on March 15th, 1944. The divers would eventually recover my body from the cockpit of the Messerschmitt. Medical personnel would attempt resuscitation procedures that would, according to their instruments and understanding, prove unsuccessful for exactly 11 minutes and 40 seconds. But I also understood that this was not the end of my story. This was just the beginning of something far more important than anything I had experienced in life. I was about to embark on a journey that would change not only my understanding of existence, but my entire purpose for being. Death, I realized, was not a destination, it was a doorway, and I was about to walk through it. I began moving away from the crash site, though I had no conscious control over the direction or speed of my travel. It wasn't like flying in an aircraft where you push controls and change direction. I was being drawn forward by something that felt both gentle and irresistible, like being carried by a current of pure love. The physical world below me grew smaller and more distant, not just in terms of space, but in terms of importance. As I moved further from my body and the rescue boats, I entered what I can only describe as a tunnel, though that word doesn't do justice to what I experienced. Imagine the most beautiful cathedral you've ever seen, but instead of stone and glass, it was made entirely of light. The walls, if you can call them walls, seemed to pulse with life and warmth. Colors existed there that have no names in any human language, shades of beauty that made everything I had ever seen on earth look gray and lifeless by comparison. The light wasn't just illumination, it was love itself, visible and tangible and alive. Every particle of that radiance carried with it emotions and knowledge and acceptance that penetrated straight to the core of my being. I felt like a man who had been living in a dark basement his entire life, suddenly walking outside into brilliant sunshine for the first time. But even that comparison falls short because this light didn't just illuminate my surroundings, it illuminated my soul. As I traveled through this tunnel of living light, I became aware that I was not alone. Other beings moved alongside me, though I couldn't see them clearly. They communicated with me without words, sharing feelings of welcome and encouragement. I understood that they were guiding me, preparing me for something of immense importance that lay ahead. Their presence filled me with a sense of safety and belonging that I had never known during my earthly life. The further I traveled, the more the light intensified, but strangely, it never became harsh or blinding. Instead, each increase in brightness brought with it deeper peace and greater understanding. Questions that had troubled me my entire life began to answer themselves without anyone speaking to me. I understood the nature of good and evil, the purpose of suffering, the meaning of love in ways that no earthly teacher could ever explain. Then, at the end of the tunnel, I saw him. He didn't look like the church paintings I had seen as a child in my grandmother's house. Those artists had tried to capture divinity with human features, but what I encountered was far beyond anything that could be painted or sculpted or described in human terms. He looked real, alive, powerful in a way that made every earthly authority figure seem like a shadow puppet by comparison. Jesus Christ stood before me, radiating presence that was simultaneously overwhelming and completely comfortable. His appearance was both ordinary and extraordinary. He looked like a man in his 30s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of physical labor. But beneath that human appearance was something infinite and eternal that my mind could barely comprehend. Power flowed from him in waves, not the destructive power of weapons or armies, but the creative power that holds galaxies in place and beats every heart in the universe. The immediate recognition surprised me. I knew who he was without anyone telling me, the same way you know your own mother's voice in a crowded room. Every cell of my being responded to his presence with a certainty that went deeper than knowledge or belief. This was the Christ I had heard about in childhood stories, but also infinitely more than any story could contain. What struck me most powerfully was his eyes. They held no condemnation, no anger about my participation in the war, no judgment about the uniform I had worn or the orders I had followed. Instead, I saw understanding so complete and acceptance so total that it brought me to my knees, though I'm not sure I still had knees in that place. His love was like standing in warm sunshine after a lifetime in cold darkness. He spoke to me, though his voice didn't use sound the way human voices do. The communication was direct, mind to mind and heart to heart, more intimate than any conversation I had ever had with another human being. When he said my name, Hans Kim, my son, I felt like he had been waiting my entire life to speak those words. Every letter of my name carried with it knowledge of who I really was beneath all the roles and uniforms and identities I had worn during my earthly existence. "You have traveled far to be here," he said, and I understood he wasn't talking about the distance from the Channel crash site. He meant the spiritual journey that had brought my soul to this moment of meeting. Every choice I had made, every doubt I had wrestled with, every moment of conscience that had troubled me during the war, all of it had been leading me toward this encounter. He knew everything about me, every thought I had ever had, every action I had ever taken, every moment of doubt and fear and anger and joy. Nothing was hidden from him, but instead of feeling exposed or ashamed, I felt completely known and completely accepted. It was like finally meeting someone who understood you perfectly after a lifetime of being misunderstood by everyone else. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever stood before someone who knew all your secrets and loved you anyway? That's what it felt like to be in the presence of Christ. He saw the worst parts of me, the moments during the war when I had acted from fear rather than conscience, the times I had chosen to follow orders rather than follow my heart. But he also saw the best parts of me, the small acts of kindness I had shown to prisoners, the doubts that had kept my humanity alive even in wartime. "Why am I here?" I asked him, still overwhelmed by the impossibility of this meeting. "I fought against Christian nations. I wore the uniform of Germany's military. I participated in a war that brought suffering to millions." His response came not in words, but in a flood of understanding that filled my consciousness completely. He showed me the difference between political systems and human souls, between earthly conflicts and eternal truths. I understood that the war was a human tragedy, not a divine judgment. Nations and armies and flags were temporary things, but souls were eternal. What mattered was not which uniform I had worn, but how I had treated other human beings while wearing it. "You are here," he told me, "because your heart was never fully given to hatred. Even in the darkest uniform, even carrying out orders you questioned, you retained your humanity. That humanity is what brought you to me." The relief that flooded through me was indescribable. For the first time since I had begun questioning my participation in the war, I felt peace about who I was and what I had done. Not because my actions were justified, but because I was forgiven. Not because I deserved mercy, but because mercy was being offered freely. But I sensed that this meeting was only the beginning. Christ's presence radiated purpose as well as love, and I understood that he had something important to show me before our time together was complete. This encounter was not just about my personal salvation. It was about something much larger than my individual destiny. "Before we continue, Hans, you must see your life as I have seen it," Jesus said, and suddenly the space around us transformed into something that contained every moment of my existence simultaneously. I found myself experiencing what I can only call a life review, but those words make it sound clinical and detached. This was anything but detached. I was reliving every single moment of my 22 years, but experiencing each one through multiple perspectives at the same time. I saw myself as a child in Munich, playing with wooden toy soldiers in my grandmother's garden. But now I could feel my grandmother's love for me as she watched from her kitchen window, the way her heart filled with joy at my innocent laughter. I experienced my father's pride when I graduated from flight school, the tears he wiped away when he thought no one was looking as I received my commission. I felt my mother's terror every night as she listened to the radio, wondering if her son was still alive. The review moved chronologically through my life, but each moment contained layers of experience that my human mind had been incapable of perceiving at the time. When I was 15 and helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, I now experienced her gratitude, her surprise at unexpected kindness from a teenager, the way that simple act reminded her that goodness still existed in an increasingly dark world. But Jesus didn't show me only the pleasant memories. I relived my first combat mission, a bombing run over a British airfield in 1942. I had been so focused on following formation and executing my orders properly that I barely thought about the human consequences below. Now I experienced that mission from the perspective of every person affected by our attack. I felt the terror of a young British mechanic named William who was servicing aircraft when our bombs began falling. I experienced his desperate sprint toward the shelter, the way his lungs burned as he ran, the split second when he realized he wouldn't make it to safety. Through his eyes, I saw the bombs falling like deadly rain, heard the whistle they made as they descended. I felt the concussive blast that killed him instantly, and then I experienced his own moment of leaving his body. his confusion and sadness at his life ending at age 19. The emotional weight of experiencing William's death from his perspective was almost unbearable. This wasn't abstract knowledge about civilian casualties or military statistics. This was feeling the exact moment when a young man's hopes and dreams and future were extinguished by bombs that I had dropped. I understood that William had been engaged to marry a girl named Margaret, that he had planned to become an aircraft designer after the war, that he wrote letters to his younger sister every week to encourage her during the difficult war years. But Jesus wasn't showing me this to torture me with guilt. As I experienced William's death, I also experienced something else. I felt Christ's presence with William in his final moments, the divine love that welcomed him home, the peace that replaced his terror when he crossed over. William's death was a tragedy caused by human warfare, but his soul was safe and cherished beyond my ability to understand. The life review continued with relentless thoroughness. I experienced every bombing mission I had flown, feeling the fear and pain of every person affected by my actions. A French farmer named Pierre who lost his barn and 3 dairy cows in a strafing run. I felt his despair as he realized his family's livelihood had been destroyed, but I also felt his determination to rebuild, his refusal to let bitterness consume him. I saw through the eyes of Martha, a German factory worker whose apartment building was hit during an Allied bombing raid, the same week I had been targeting British positions. I experienced her final moments as she shielded her 2 young daughters with her body, felt her prayer asking God to take care of her children, experienced her relief when she realized her sacrifice had worked and her daughters had survived. Look inside your own heart right now and try to imagine feeling the death of every person affected by your actions, not as abstract guilt, but as if you were experiencing their final moments yourself. That was what Jesus was showing me, but always alongside his perspective of divine love receiving each soul, his grief at human suffering, his desire for reconciliation and healing. The review wasn't limited to the dramatic moments of combat. I experienced every interaction with prisoners of war, every conversation with fellow pilots, every letter I had written home. When I had shared my rations with a captured British airman in 1943, I now felt his surprise and gratitude, the way that unexpected kindness reminded him that his enemies were human beings like himself. I experienced how that simple act of compassion had affected his treatment of German prisoners after he escaped 6 months later. I'm asking you, just as someone who has stood before divine judgment, to consider how every action we take ripples outward in ways we never imagine. When I had helped carry a wounded comrade to safety after our airfield was bombed, I now experienced not only his gratitude but the gratitude of his wife and children who never knew my name, but whose lives were preserved by my choice to risk my own safety for another. Jesus highlighted these moments of compassion and humanity with special attention. You see, Hans? His voice filled my consciousness. Even in the darkest uniform wearing the wrong symbols, your soul continued to choose love whenever possible. These choices matter more than you can understand. I experienced moments when I had failed to choose compassion, times when fear or peer pressure or simple thoughtlessness had led me to act with cruelty or indifference. I felt the pain I had caused, the opportunities for kindness I had missed, the ways my failures had contributed to the darkness of war, but each of these experiences was surrounded by Christ's endless mercy. His understanding of human weakness, his desire to transform failure into wisdom. The most powerful part of the life review came when Jesus showed me the thoughts and prayers of my enemies. British pilots I had fought against had prayed for God to protect their families, exactly as I had prayed for mine. Allied soldiers had struggled with the same questions about killing and duty that kept me awake at night. Enemy airmen had felt the same mixture of fear and determination that I knew so well. You have all been fighting the same war, Jesus told me. The war between love and fear, between choosing humanity or choosing hatred. The uniforms and flags and national boundaries are human constructions. What I see are souls struggling to remain connected to love in the midst of violence. I understood then that the war had not been a cosmic battle between good and evil nations. It had been millions of individual human beings, each faced with countless daily choices between fear and love, between cruelty and compassion, between hatred and forgiveness. Some had chosen better than others, but all had been struggling with the same fundamental spiritual challenges. The revelation that shook me most profoundly was understanding that many of my enemies had been praying to the same God I served, asking for protection and guidance and forgiveness. Christ had been present with British and American and Soviet soldiers just as he had been present with German soldiers. His love transcended every human boundary and embraced every soul regardless of nationality or political allegiance. As the life review concluded, Jesus turned to me with infinite compassion in his eyes. "Now you understand why you are here, Hans. Your work on earth is not finished. You have seen how love can exist even in the midst of hatred, how humanity can survive even in wartime. You will return to share this understanding with others, to help heal the wounds that this conflict has created." The weight of what Jesus had just told me settled over my consciousness like a heavy blanket. Return to earth? The very idea seemed impossible after experiencing the perfect peace and love of his presence. How could I possibly go back to the physical world with its pain and limitations and conflicts after tasting paradise? Yet even as these thoughts formed, I felt a deep stirring within my spirit, an understanding that this was indeed why I had been brought here. "Your work on earth is not finished, Hans," Jesus repeated, his voice carrying both infinite gentleness and absolute authority. "You have been chosen to bridge the gap between enemies, to carry a message of forgiveness that can only come from someone who has experienced divine mercy firsthand. The healing that this world needs can only begin when people understand that love is stronger than hatred, that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge." He gestured, and suddenly I could see glimpses of the future spreading out before us like scenes painted on translucent glass. I saw myself years older, standing before congregations in Germany, sharing the story of this encounter. I watched faces transform as people heard the message of God's love extending beyond national boundaries. Former soldiers wept as they understood they could be forgiven for actions they thought were unforgivable. In one vision, I saw myself meeting with William's fiancée, Margaret, the young woman whose future husband I had inadvertently killed in that bombing raid. I watched myself explaining what I had experienced during the life review, how I had felt William's final moments and seen his soul welcomed into God's presence. I saw the moment when decades of hatred and grief in Margaret's heart began to dissolve, replaced by an understanding that transcended human justice. Another scene showed me working with children orphaned by the war, both German and Allied orphans together. I saw the moment when a British boy whose father had died in combat chose to forgive rather than hate, inspired by the story of divine love I would share with him. These children would grow up to become bridges between nations, carrying forward a message of reconciliation instead of perpetuating cycles of revenge. "You will face ridicule and disbelief," Jesus warned me, his voice filled with compassion for the difficulties ahead. "Many will dismiss your experience as hallucination or propaganda. Your former comrades will accuse you of betraying your country. Religious leaders will question whether your vision truly came from God, but some will believe, and through their belief, healing will spread like ripples in a pond." The visions continued, showing me the long-term impact of the message I would carry. I saw former enemies embracing at veteran reunions, their hatred transformed into understanding through the testimony of divine love. I watched marriages restored as soldiers learned to forgive themselves for wartime actions, enabling them to accept love from their families. I saw communities divided by war coming together to build something better than what had been destroyed. But Jesus also showed me the personal cost I would pay for accepting this mission. I saw the loneliness of being a German soldier who preached forgiveness and love for former enemies. I experienced the suspicion and hostility I would face from those who couldn't understand how someone could abandon loyalty to nation for loyalty to a higher truth. I felt the weight of carrying a message that many would consider treasonous or naive. Ask yourself this question, Jesus said, using the exact phrase I would later use countless times in my ministry. Is temporary comfort worth more than eternal purpose? Will you choose the easy path of returning to your old life, or will you accept the difficult calling of becoming an instrument of divine reconciliation? The choice he was offering wasn't really a choice at all. How could I possibly refuse such a mission after experiencing his love so completely? Yet I understood that the decision had to be freely made. God never forces anyone to serve him, even when the need is desperate and the cause is righteous. Love that is compelled is not true love, and service that is coerced is not true service. I want to stay here with you, I told him honestly. This peace, this love, this understanding, it's everything I've been searching for my entire life without knowing what I was looking for. The world below seems so dark and painful compared to what I'm experiencing now. How can I choose to leave paradise and return to suffering? Jesus smiled with infinite understanding. Because paradise will be waiting for you when your earthly mission is complete. What you're experiencing now is your eternal home, and nothing can take that away from you. But there are souls still trapped in darkness who need someone to show them that the light exists. You have seen both sides of this conflict, felt the humanity of enemies, experienced divine forgiveness for actions you thought were unforgivable. Who better to carry this message? He showed me one more vision then, perhaps the most powerful of all. I saw the moment of my death decades in the future, surrounded by children and grandchildren I hadn't yet met, people whose lives had been transformed by the message of love and forgiveness I would spend my remaining years sharing. I experienced the joy of my final return to his presence, the welcome of souls I had helped find their way to God, the celebration in heaven as another mission was completed successfully. The suffering you will endure is real, Jesus acknowledged me. The rejection and misunderstanding and loneliness will test your faith again and again. But you will never be alone. I will be with you in every moment, strengthening you when you feel weak, reminding you of this encounter when doubt creeps in, sending others to support your mission when the burden seems too heavy to bear. I felt his love surrounding me completely, filling every corner of my being with warmth and strength and purpose. The decision crystallized in my heart with perfect clarity. Of course I would return. How could I do anything else after experiencing such overwhelming love? The very idea of keeping this gift to myself while others remained trapped in darkness became unthinkable. I will go, I told him, and the moment I spoke those words, I felt a transformation beginning within my spirit. The fear and uncertainty that had defined so much of my earthly life dissolved completely, replaced by unshakable confidence in divine love. I would return to the world as a different person entirely, carrying within me an experience of God's presence that nothing could diminish or destroy. Remember everything you have seen and felt here, Jesus instructed me. Remember the love that embraces former enemies, the forgiveness that extends beyond human understanding, the peace that exists beyond earthly conflicts. When people reject your message, remember that you are not speaking your own words, but mine. When they accuse you of betraying your country, remember that your true citizenship is in the kingdom of heaven. The journey back to my physical body began immediately, but it was nothing like the frightening experience of dying. Instead of the desperate struggle in cold channel water, I felt like I was being gently carried by invisible hands of love. The tunnel of light opened before me again, but this time I was traveling toward the physical world rather than away from it. As I moved back through that corridor of divine presence, I carried with me every moment of my encounter with Christ, every detail of the life review, every vision of the future mission he had given me. Nothing was lost or forgotten. The experience remained as vivid and real as breathing, more real than any earthly memory I possessed. Ask yourself this question. If you had experienced the love of God so completely that it transformed your understanding of everything you thought you knew about life and death and purpose, would you be able to keep silent about it? That's the question I faced as I returned to my broken body in that British field hospital, carrying within me the greatest story ever told and the absolute certainty that I had been chosen to tell it. The return to my physical body was like being forced back into a suit of clothes that no longer fit. One moment I was traveling through that corridor of divine light, carrying the presence of Christ within every fiber of my spiritual being, and the next moment I was gasping for air in a hospital bed, pain shooting through every nerve ending in my body. The contrast was so jarring that for several seconds I couldn't understand what had happened to me. My first sensation was the crushing weight of my broken ribs pressing against my lungs. Every breath felt like breathing through broken glass. The cold that had killed me was gone, replaced by the antiseptic warmth of a British field hospital, but my body felt alien and heavy after the freedom I had experienced in spirit. I opened my eyes to see the shocked faces of medical personnel staring down at me as if they had just witnessed a resurrection. "Dear God, he's breathing," one of the nurses whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. "Doctor, come quickly. The German pilot, he's alive." I tried to speak to tell them about what I had experienced, but my throat was raw from the seawater, and my voice came out as barely a croak. "Jesus," I managed to whisper. "I saw Jesus." The medical team exchanged glances that clearly indicated they thought I was delirious from oxygen deprivation. One of them made a note on my chart about possible brain damage from prolonged submersion. The doctor who examined me kept shaking his head in amazement. 11 minutes and 42 seconds, he muttered. "I've never seen anyone survive that long without oxygen. By all medical understanding, you should be dead or at minimum severely brain damaged." He shined a light in my eyes, tested my reflexes, asked me questions to assess my mental state. I answered everything correctly, but I could see he was struggling to reconcile my obvious mental clarity with what he knew about drowning victims. During the weeks of recovery that followed in the prisoner of war camp, I had nothing to do but think about what had happened to me. The physical injuries were healing, but the spiritual transformation I had undergone was so complete that I felt like a different person inhabiting the same body. Every moment of my encounter with Christ remained vivid in my memory, not fading the way dreams or hallucinations typically do, but growing clearer and more meaningful with each passing day. I tried to share my experience with fellow prisoners, but their reactions ranged from polite disbelief to open hostility. Hans Kruger, a panzer commander who had been captured in France, listened to my story with increasing anger. "You're talking like a traitor," he told me bluntly. "Claiming that God appeared to you and told you to love our enemies? That's not Christianity, that's madness. We're German soldiers. Our duty is to Germany, not to some mystical vision that contradicts everything we've been taught about honor and loyalty." Other prisoners were more diplomatic but equally skeptical. They attributed my experience to trauma, to guilt over civilian casualties, to the oxygen deprivation I had suffered during the crash. "The mind plays tricks under extreme stress," one of them explained kindly. "What you experienced felt real because your brain was trying to process the trauma of dying, but it wasn't actually real. But I knew better. Look into your own heart right now and ask yourself whether you could mistake a dream for the most real experience of your entire life. What I had encountered was more substantial, more present, more undeniably true than any earthly experience I had ever had. The love I felt in Christ's presence was not an emotion or a feeling. It was a force, a reality, a truth so fundamental that questioning it would be like questioning whether the sun gives light. The turning point came when I gained access to a Bible in the prison library. I had grown up hearing Bible stories, but I had never really read scripture for myself with any serious intent. Now, as I read the words of Jesus recorded in the Gospels, I found exact parallels to what he had said to me during my encounter. His message about loving enemies, about forgiveness being more powerful than revenge, about God's love extending beyond tribal boundaries, all of it matched perfectly with what I had experienced. I spent hours memorizing passages, particularly from the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you," I heard his voice exactly as I had heard it during my near-death experience. When he taught, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God," I understood that this was precisely the mission he had given me. The decision to openly convert to Christianity came gradually, but inevitably. By the time winter arrived at the POW camp, I was conducting informal Bible studies for any prisoners who were interested. Most avoided these gatherings, but a few men attended regularly, drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. I shared not just what I had read in Scripture, but what I had experienced firsthand about God's love and forgiveness. Werner Schmidt, a young infantryman from Bavaria, was the first to accept Christ through my testimony. He had been carrying crushing guilt about a village massacre he had witnessed but failed to stop. When I told him about experiencing divine forgiveness during my life review, about seeing how Christ grieved over human suffering while still loving every soul involved, Werner wept like a child. "You mean God can forgive even that?" he asked. "Even my cowardice? Even my silence when innocent people were killed?" "I'm telling you as someone who has stood before divine judgment," I answered him, using words that would become my standard response to such questions. Forgiveness is possible for anything, but only if we're willing to receive it and let it transform us. When the war ended in 1945 and we were finally released, Werner and I returned to Germany together. The country we found was devastated, not just physically, but spiritually. Cities lay in ruins, families were destroyed, and the entire population was grappling with the reality of what had been done in their name. Many Germans were defensive, denying knowledge of atrocities or claiming they had just been following orders. Others were consumed with shame and guilt that seemed beyond healing. I began sharing my testimony in churches, community centers, anywhere people would listen. The reception was often hostile. Many Germans saw my message of loving former enemies as unpatriotic, even treasonous. "While our cities burn and our people starve," one man shouted at me during a meeting in Munich, "you tell us to love the ones who did this to us? You tell us to forgive the bombers and the occupiers? What kind of German are you?" "I'm telling you as someone who has experienced God's love firsthand," I replied. "That hatred will only create more destruction. The cycle of revenge and retaliation will never end unless someone chooses to break it. Christ chose me to carry this message because I was part of the problem. I wore the uniform. I dropped the bombs. I participated in the hatred. If God can forgive me, He can forgive anyone. If I can learn to love former enemies, anyone can." Slowly, very slowly, people began to listen. The transformation usually began with individual conversations after my presentations. A former soldier would approach me privately, wanting to talk about guilt he couldn't shake. A war widow would ask whether God could really forgive the hatred in her heart. A young person who had grown up surrounded by violence would wonder whether a different way of living was possible. The most powerful moments came when I had opportunities to meet with former enemies. In 1948, through a Christian reconciliation organization, I was able to meet Margaret Thompson, the British woman whose fiancé William Nunn had killed during that bombing raid in 1942. She had agreed to the meeting reluctantly, still carrying 6 years of grief and anger. I told her about my life review, about experiencing William's final moments, about seeing his soul welcomed into Christ's presence. "He wasn't alone when he died," I explained. "God was with him, and he's with God now. The war took his earthly life, but it couldn't touch his eternal soul." Margaret listened with tears streaming down her face. "I've hated you for 6 years," she said finally. "I've hated all Germans, all pilots, all soldiers. The hatred was eating me alive, but I didn't know how to let go of it. Look inside your own heart right now," I told her, using the phrase Jesus had taught me. "You'll find that the love you felt for William is stronger than the hatred you've carried about his death. That love comes from God, and it's the same love that can heal the hatred." By the end of our conversation, Margaret had not only forgiven me, but had committed to joining the reconciliation work. She went on to establish a foundation that brought together war orphans from all sides of the conflict, teaching them that they could choose to build bridges instead of perpetuating cycles of revenge. This became the pattern of my ministry for the next 30 years. I would share my testimony, face initial hostility or skepticism, then watch as individual hearts began to open to the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. Former SS officers learned to work alongside Holocaust survivors. Luftwaffe pilots embraced Royal Air Force veterans. German civilians who had suffered under Allied bombing began partnering with British and American families who had lost loved ones to German attacks. The work was never easy. For every person who accepted the message of divine love, 10 others rejected it as naive or impossible. For every reconciliation celebration, there were dozens of meetings that ended in argument or walked-out audiences. The loneliness was sometimes overwhelming, especially in the early years when it felt like I was the only person in Germany preaching love for enemies. But I was never truly alone. Just as Jesus had promised during my encounter with him, his presence remained with me through every difficult moment. When my faith wavered, when the rejection seemed unbearable, when the magnitude of the hatred and division seemed impossible to overcome, I would remember those 11 minutes and 42 seconds in his presence, and strength would flow back into my spirit. Now I ask you, what will you do with what you've heard today? The same divine love that transformed me is available to everyone. The same forgiveness that healed my guilt can heal yours. The same power that broke cycles of hatred in post-war Germany can break cycles of division and revenge in your own life and community. What I experienced that day over the English Channel was more real than anything before or since. Jesus changed everything, not just my eternal destination, but my daily purpose. The love I encountered in his presence is still transforming lives today, still building bridges between former enemies, still proving that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge.